So I'd like to introduce Radha to speak on temporary sponsorship for 10 minutes, followed by 10 minutes of Q&A. Radha, how would you like your time?
All right. Yeah, thank you all for your service. I am Radha, sex, love, and fantasy addict. If you see me looking down, I'm looking at my notes over here. This has been a really, really fascinating discussion. Uh, I was wondering what else can I learn about sponsorship, and I was wrong. And you will see throughout my share that that's a big part of my temporary sponsorship experience. So I entered the program August 2020, virtual world. I'm in PA, in Philadelphia. So at the time, there were only online meetings, like in a lot of other places. And I started attending this daily meeting that was just full of dudes. And like, I didn't mind that there were no women in the room, because I'm very comfortable in being in like a group of dudes. And so I convinced myself, maybe 2 months into the program, that there were no women, although I was attending all these other meetings, that there were no women close to me geographically, and that I was going to work the steps on my own because I was a very smart person, and all I had to do was read these books and answer these questions. And, I did that my whole life in school. But then I remember going to this daily meeting and hearing one of the guys who I grew to respect a lot in their recovery, saying that they had been in program for a very long time. I think 7 years, and they had never worked the steps. And it was at that moment that I realized, and then they said, I recommend to every newcomer to get a sponsor, that I needed to do something about it. So I started attending meetings, but as talkative as I am on like a real life basis, I had a really hard time sharing during meetings. That's not where my voice was at the time. But I saw that GDVI was holding an event. I think it was something about love. I can't remember exactly what it was, but I signed up for it. It was a Saturday, and very similar to what we're doing today. And I saw a bunch of women there, and there was just something about seeing the women being so welcoming that I said, "Oh, I think I need a sponsor." And I connected with a few of those women, and one of those women said, let's talk, let's connect. Here's my number. And that kind of left it at that. So I started calling all these women and just following up and, talking just about myself. I wasn't sure that I knew what I was looking for. I wasn't sure that I knew what sobriety meant. I remember that I would show up to my meetings, and they would say, if you're celebrating 1 day of sobriety, or 2 days or 1 month. And I kept thinking, well, I'm not physically acting out, but I don't know what sobriety means to me. So about 2.5 months into me being in the rooms, I called, one of the women, and they told me that they offered temporary sponsorship. And asked me if this was something I was interested in. And I had no idea what that meant, but I knew that I needed a sponsor because that guy had told me that he had been in program for 7 years and he hadn't worked the steps. And I had already made a commitment to myself that I would not date until I finished my steps. So, what brought me into the program was still what was driving me, the men. So I wanted to date eventually, so I had to work the steps. And I started this temporary sponsorship relationship with this woman. And at first I was like, yeah, this is why they say that, sometimes you meet people in the rooms that you would not meet otherwise, because this person lives in another state. They have a very different line of work. We don't have any social circles in common. It was just like a godsend. But I knew there was something in her voice that reassured me that, there may be something here. And I think the first thing that I saw was that this person showed true compassion towards my, towards where I was. And they had boundaries, which I knew I didn't have, because what led me to program was a book I was reading on women who had no boundaries. And so when I started, listening, I realized that my ego would have to come down, that I didn't know it all. And they had a structure for how they liked to run their temporary sponsorship. They said it's 30 days. I will ask you to do this. And I was kicking and screaming halfway through it because I'm in a line of work where I'm always talking to people. And I said, you want me to call 3 people after a long day of work and talk to humans?
5 minutes.
Thank you. And talk to humans. And they said yes. And you will thank me one day if this moves past the 30 days. And I did. And I think for me, I was very obedient, and that helped. So I guess, something that helped me during that temporary sponsorship, and this is where I have to reference my notes, is that my sponsor was very open to being flexible and creative. So, they wanted me to check in on a daily basis. They wanted me to call. I was like, I just don't have any more words by 9 p.m. Like, I just don't. And they said, okay, well, send me an email. So they were willing to work with me. They were willing to, listen to the fact that I didn't feel comfortable with the SLAA workbook, and gave me alternatives to other, books that were used in program, but were not conference approved. They also had a very solid relationship with their service commitments, which that signaled to me that this person was not only committed to their sobriety, but they were committed to the fellowship, which I thought was really important because I didn't want my recovery to be a one and done. I knew, and I learned very early on through all those dudes that I still, go to meetings with, that this was a long game, that I was not going to do this once and recover. And so with this temporary sponsorship, it worked out really well for me because I learned not only about boundaries, but I learned about the SLAA resources and I had to do the 30 and 30 and a lot of things that I thought I didn't have time for, but that I knew this person knew what they were talking about because they couldn't get to where they were. So it was almost like blindly trusting that regardless of what would happen, I would be better off than what I initially was. And that was really hard for me because I didn't have a good relationship with the women in my life when I came into program. So establishing that trust and those relationships was really important. And thankfully for me, this person became my sponsor and is still my sponsor to this day, and has been with me through so many crazy, unexpected life situations. And then I had an opportunity to do a temporary sponsorship relationship with someone, and I kind of used the same format, and it didn't work. It just didn't work. And I think that that's something that I heard over and over through some of the shares and speakers, is that I thought I was a failure because my temporary, right? It's in the name, temporary sponsorship relationship didn't work out. But I think in the same vein, I felt really proud of that other person that as an addict, they were able to say, this is not working out for me. And I was able to say, yeah, I've been thinking about it for some time too. I don't know that this will turn into a full-fledged sponsor-sponsee relationship. And to this day, we're still in touch. And I think that was huge for me because I'm a know-it-all. And although this program has toned down my ego quite a lot, and I know when to check myself, there was something about sponsoring that almost felt like I was mentoring this person. And then a wise man who's in this room then said, there's a difference between mentoring and sponsorship. And I was like, oh, wow. And so it was a process of adaptation. I think that's what the temporary sponsorship taught me, because this is a program of recovery, and we're all recovering from similar yet different things. And I had a lot of codependency. And so now I know, right? I currently don't have a sponsee because my life is just crazy. And that was the number one rule I learned, quote unquote rule. There's not, an article, but like the one tip I learned with working with my current sponsor and with my temporary sponsee is that you have to have time. And be honest about time. I see my time. I see I got 1 minute. Thanks, Will. I loved overcommitting, before entering program. I'm one of those people who was overly productive to not sit down and think about their feelings and not think about their life. And now I realize that in order to open myself up to a sponsee, I have to have the time. And not time in a, oh, I don't have time because I'm so busy, but in a true, is this a priority for me right now? Because that's what I learned from my sponsor. My sponsor always told me, these are my boundaries. This is when we will talk. But if it's something really, really important, you can always reach me. And to me, time is very valuable. It's the one thing that as a human, I cannot get back. And so I respect when, when others give me their time, and I know that as an addict, I can spend a lot of time doing things that are not beneficial to me. So I guess I would just close with saying that if anyone is ever thinking of whether, I heard about interviews, and I heard also the concern of the availability of sponsors. I found that the temporary sponsor model worked really well because this is that one stretch of time that one has to even know whether, because you can interview. I find that you can interview someone, you can speak to someone, and then the reality is very different. But that's my share, and that's what's worked for me. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Rada. For anyone who has questions, please raise your virtual hand and Rada will call on you. Will the timekeeper please let us know when 10 minutes have elapsed? Deborah, yes.
Actually, thank you again, Rada. That was a great share. But what I have is actually not so much of a question as a comment. I love that you talked about service sponsorship, because in the last round, I was going to mention that I didn't know early on anything about service, much less a service sponsor, or that there was a difference. And I wanted to just kind of highlight that, because once I actually started doing service and somebody said, do you have a service sponsor? And I said, what's that? And I got one. I realized that it was a very different kind of relationship, and a very valuable relationship, because I was working at a different level and on different kinds of issues once I started doing service, especially once I got out of sort of my local group and started working at the intergroup and area and national and even international levels. So I just wanted to highlight that, because I think it's a really valuable part of recovery. The fact that these fellowships happen all over the world in all different kinds of languages and in all different kinds of cultures, to me, is part of the miracle of recovery. And it's partially because of people who do service. And part of how we keep ourselves sober is by having service sponsors. So I just wanted to highlight that. Thank you again for your share.
Thank you.
Sorry, Rada, I was accidentally calling it. You can call on who you would like.
No, not a problem. I see Joe's hand is raised.
Hi, I'm Joe. I'm a sex and love addict. Thanks, Rada. I appreciate you having shared. One question I had is, because I always struggle with, when should I let go and when should I stand up for myself? Did you ever feel like the demands of your temporary sponsor were overbearing or domineering, or did you ever have any resentments for any of that kind of stuff? Or how do you know when do you have any hints for yourself as to what constituted acceptable or non-acceptable behavior type of thing? Where do you draw that line, and how do you figure that out?
Yeah, that's a really good question, Joe, and one that I definitely had to speak to my sponsor about when that time came about. I think that there were some pretty tangible things, I asked my sponsee to do the work, and they just were not in a place for whatever reason to do the work. So that, to me, again, going back to what I shared about time being something that's important to me, if you just want to catch up on the phone and not do the work, and for whatever reason, right, that was not going to work for me, because I knew that I was investing time in the relationship. So those were more direct things. Are you calling? We said that we would speak at this time, but you didn't for whatever reason. Maybe there was a legitimate reason why they didn't call at that time. That's fine. But if that's a pattern, then we need to address that. Or if our schedules weren't matching up. So there were some things that were pretty straightforward. And then there were some things that were more nuanced. Honesty was something, right? If in my spirit, if I felt like my emotional sobriety was being disturbed, then I knew that something was up. And things like honesty, is this real? Is this not? things like, the program says, but my therapist says, and the conflict that some of those things cause for an individual that I knew were just beyond me. That those were some of those things that I had to take it inside and say, is this something that I'm comfortable working with? And if, when the answer became no, because I just knew that my sobriety, because I would get off a call and wonder, how, what just happened? Was that real? That doesn't check out. That doesn't, for whatever reason, then I just knew it was time to kind of let it go, or that it wasn't working out. So I don't know if that answers your question, but I think for me, I've learned that my emotional sobriety is more than just, the S and the L part of the addiction, and more how am I interacting with someone, and how is this interaction impacting me and impacting my peace of mind? And if that's being disturbed, then I don't know that that's something that I'm okay with putting up with, if that makes sense.
It makes a lot of sense. And I just, one follow-up thing is, since self-esteem is one of the critical areas that we deal with, especially in early sobriety, I just wondered and you described it really well, how you assess whether this is helping my self-esteem or whether this is like damaging my self-esteem. I mean, you put it in terms of peace of mind, but I think it's largely the same. For me, it would be the same thing, that sense of disturbing my peace of mind versus, no, this seems like it's a completely acceptable thing to comply with or whatever. So thank you.
Yeah, of course. I think the only thing I would say, because I thought about that at one point, is that I think the reason why I say the emotional and peace of mind versus self-esteem is because I knew that I was just offering from my cup, right? That I was offering from my experience, strength, and hope. And whether that matched with that person or didn't match with that person's experience, said nothing about my esteem as a person versus, the reaction of that interaction towards me, if that makes sense. So, but I appreciate that, Joe. Thank you.
Any other questions for Radha?
No, it's fine. So just so that I'm clear, so your question is, how did I come about sponsoring? Okay. Sponsoring someone. Yeah, that's a really good question. So it was through word of mouth. So my sponsor thought that I was at a pretty good place to maybe take on a sponsee. And they made the connection, but I know that, others have found temporary sponsors through, doing outreach and just kind of sharing with others that they are looking for sponsors. Oh, there's a question in the chat box. What are your feelings about sponsoring through text? That's an interesting one. I am really bad texter. I'm just bad. It's either I answer right now or 10 days later. Like, there's just no, in good addict fashion, there's just no in between for me. But this is a very interesting one, because I feel like it worked really well as a form of communication with my temporary sponsee, because they weren't always comfortable speaking up. And that worked. I knew that that's the way they preferred to communicate. And I did what my sponsor did with me. I got creative and adjusted. And so if it works for you, if it works for your sponsor, then or for the temporary sponsor, I don't see why not. There's no, as everyone has said over and over, there's not a quote unquote right way of doing sponsor-sponsee relationships. Thank you, Stephanie. Tanya.
Hi, thank you for your share. My question is, when you say you're a temporary sponsor, I guess how long is temporary? My first sponsor said she'd sponsor me temporary, but I know it's just a 30-day trial. So when you say temporary, sponsoring people who are only going to be there for, like, in Philadelphia for a month, or just starting a project or finishing a project. So how do I know? How do you decide, and what does temporary mean for you?
Yeah, that's a good question. So with my sponsor, we did temporary 30 days. And, there was no formal, check, like, is this working? Is this not working? We just kind of talked as we talked, and we saw that, this was something that was more long term. We just kind of went with it. But with my sponsee, I said 60 days just because I felt that, they were far away from me. It was also a remote sponsee situation. I just felt like 30 days when, you still have to coordinate schedules and all that was very short. So we did about 2 months. And then, when that time came, it wasn't an official, or let's do an official check-in. It was more, we both knew and we had the discussion. So I would say that's something that can be defined up front. If you're like me and you like knowing what things mean, then it may be a conversation worth having up front. Is it 30 days, and we'll reevaluate, make a conscious effort to check in after those 30 days or 45 or whatever it, works out to be.
That's time.
Okay. Thank you, Will.
Thank you, Rada. Let's thank Rada again for her share.
Thanks, Rada.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
And thank you all for joining us today and showing up for yourself and your recovery.